A month after my brother disappeared, I finally got access to his apartment. The landlord met me outside. "I need to show you something, but get your family here first. All of them." When he opened the bedroom door, I couldn't breathe. The bedroom walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs, documents, and red string connecting them like something from a detective's war room. But these weren't random conspiracy theories. Every photo showed my brother with different people, teenagers mostly, and every document had one name appearing over and over: Richard Ashford, our youth pastor, the man who'd mentored my brother since he was 13, the man our entire family trusted with everything. And in the center of it all, printed in my brother's handwriting on a large whiteboard: "If you're reading this, I'm either dead or running. Richard has been blackmailing me for 6 years. These are his other victims. Do not let him destroy this evidence." I'd been searching for my brother Dylan for 31 days when the landlord finally called. Dylan had vanished on October 8th without warning, without explanation, leaving behind his car, his phone, and an apartment he'd paid rent on for 3 months in advance. The police had filed a missing persons report, but told our family that 26-year-old men disappear by choice all the time. They'd checked hospitals, morgues, and his bank accounts. Nothing. It was like he'd evaporated. Our mother had been calling me every morning at 6:15 asking if I'd heard anything, her voice getting smaller each day. Our father had driven to every place Dylan frequented, showing his photo to strangers who shook their heads with practiced sympathy. And I'd been going through Dylan's social media, his emails, anything I could access, looking for clues about where he might have gone or why. Dylan and I had always been close despite the 4-year age gap. He was the sensitive one, artistic and thoughtful, while I'd been the practical older sister who pushed through college and law school with grim determination. Dylan had struggled more, changing majors 3 times before finally dropping out to work in graphic design. Our parents had been disappointed but tried to hide it. Richard Ashford had been the one constant support in Dylan's life during those difficult years. Richard had started as youth pastor at Cornerstone Community Church when Dylan was 13 and I was 17. He was young for a pastor, only 28 at the time, energetic and relatable in ways the senior pastor wasn't. He'd organized camping trips and mission projects and had this gift for making troubled kids feel seen and valued. Dylan had attached to him immediately, spending hours at the church helping with youth events and seeking Richard's advice about everything from college choices to relationship problems. Our family had loved Richard. He'd been at every holiday dinner for the past 13 years. He was godfather to my younger cousin. He'd officiated 3 weddings in our extended family. When I'd gone through my divorce 2 years ago, Richard had been the one who'd counseled me through it, sitting in coffee shops for hours listening to me process my anger and grief. He'd seemed genuinely caring, genuinely invested in our family's well-being. The idea that he could be connected to Dylan's disappearance felt impossible, but here was an entire room of evidence suggesting otherwise. The landlord, a heavyset man in his 60s named Frank Castellano, stood in the doorway behind me. He'd managed this building for 23 years and had seen plenty of strange tenant situations, but his face was pale as he watched me process what we were seeing. Frank had called me that morning at 9:30 and said I needed to come to Dylan's apartment immediately, but that I should bring my parents and anyone else who needed to see what he'd found. He wouldn't explain over the phone, just kept saying it was important, and that I'd understand when I got there. I'd called my parents and we'd driven over together, all of us tense with hope and dread about what might be waiting. When Frank had led us to the bedroom and opened the door, my mother had gasped and grabbed my father's arm. My father had gone completely silent, staring at the walls like he was trying to decode a foreign language. And I'd felt my throat close up as I recognized Richard's face in dozens of photographs, always with teenagers, always with that warm pastoral smile that had fooled us all for over a decade. I stepped further into the room, my hands shaking as I examined the documents more closely. There were bank statements showing regular transfers from Richard's personal account to Dylan's account, thousands of dollars over multiple years. There were printed text messages between Dylan and Richard, conversations that started friendly and slowly turned threatening. One exchange from 3 years ago showed Richard writing, "You know what happens if you tell anyone? Your family's reputation, your mother's standing in the church, all of it disappears. Plus, you'd be admitting your own involvement. Who do you think they'd believe?" Dylan's response, "I was 16 when this started. You manipulated me." Richard's reply, "Courts don't care about timeline when the evidence is this clear. You helped me. That makes you complicit." The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed Richard with at least 15 different teenagers over the years, all boys between roughly 14 and 18, all at church events or on mission trips or in private settings that looked inappropriate for a youth pastor. Some photos had names written on the back in Dylan's handwriting along with dates and locations. I recognized a few of the faces, kids who'd gone through Cornerstone's youth program over the years. Others were strangers to me. There were also printouts of financial records showing Richard had been embezzling from the church's youth fund, taking money designated for mission trips and scholarships and funneling it into personal accounts. The amounts were staggering, over $380,000 across 9 years. My mother was crying softly behind me, and my father kept saying, "This can't be right," over and over like a prayer. Frank cleared his throat and said he'd found the room exactly like this when he'd done a routine maintenance check yesterday. Dylan's rent was paid through December, so Frank hadn't had reason to enter the apartment before now, but a pipe had burst in the unit below and he'd needed to check for water damage. He'd found the bedroom door locked from the inside with a padlock and had to cut it off. When he'd seen what was inside, he'd immediately called me instead of the police because he'd figured the family should see it first. He said he'd touched nothing except the door lock and had kept the room secured since discovery. That professionalism would matter later when evidence chains became critical. I pulled out my phone and started taking photographs of everything, documenting each wall systematically. My legal training was kicking in, overriding the emotional shock. This was evidence of serious crimes: embezzlement, fraud, potential abuse, extortion, blackmail. If Dylan had compiled this information and then disappeared, it meant he'd either fled to escape Richard's control, or something worse had happened to prevent him from using it. The whiteboard message suggested Dylan had expected someone to find this eventually, which meant he'd prepared for the possibility of his own death or permanent disappearance. That thought made my stomach turn. My little brother had been living in fear for years, documenting abuse and manipulation, and none of us had known. We'd sat at dinner tables with Richard, laughed at his jokes, asked his advice, while he was systematically destroying Dylan's life. I found a laptop on the desk, password protected but with a sticky note attached. Password: Mom's birthday 1957. Everything is backed up to cloud drive under Dylan Evidence 2024. I opened the laptop and entered the password. It worked. The desktop background was a photo of our family from 5 years ago at the beach, all of us smiling and sunburned and happy. Dylan had been 21 in that photo, already 3 years into whatever nightmare Richard had trapped him in, and he'd been smiling like everything was fine. How had we not seen it? How had I, his older sister who prided myself on being observant and protective, missed that my brother was being blackmailed and abused? The laptop contained folders organized by victim name, each one filled with evidence Dylan had compiled. I opened one labeled Jason Whitmore and found photos, screenshots of text conversations, bank transfer records, and a written timeline of Richard's relationship with this particular teenager. According to Dylan's notes, Jason had been 15 when Richard began mentoring him privately, taking him on trips and giving him gifts and special attention. The relationship had lasted 2 years before Jason aged out of Richard's interest and was discarded. Dylan had tracked Jason down last year and interviewed him, getting a recorded statement about the manipulation and inappropriate behavior. The recording was saved in the folder with a timestamp and location tag. Dylan had been building legal cases against Richard for multiple victims, meticulously documenting everything in ways that would hold up in court. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. His voice was rough when he spoke. "We need to call the police right now, today. This man has been in our home, around our family, around other people's children." My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. "Why didn't Dylan tell us? Why didn't he come to us with this?" I turned to face them, my own eyes burning. Because Richard convinced him we'd blame him, that we'd believe Richard over him, that it would destroy our family's reputation at the church. Look at these messages. Richard told Dylan he was complicit, that he'd go down too if he talked. Dylan was 16 when this started. Richard groomed him, and then used that grooming as blackmail to keep him silent for a decade. Frank spoke up from the doorway. "I'm calling my lawyer before this goes further. I need to protect myself legally since I'm the one who found all this." That was reasonable. I nodded. "We're calling the police, today, right now, but we need to do this carefully to preserve evidence integrity. Let me make the call." I dialed Detective Lisa Kowalski, a detective with the Portland Police Bureau's Special Victims Unit who I'd worked with on a case during my brief stint at the DA's office 3 years ago. Lisa had 26 years on the force and specialized in cases involving exploitation of minors and institutional abuse. If anyone would take this seriously and handle it properly, it was her. Lisa answered on the third ring. "Christine, it's been a while. What's going on?" I explained the situation as calmly as I could. My brother's disappearance, the apartment discovery, the evidence of blackmail and embezzlement and multiple victims. Lisa went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Don't touch anything else. I'm sending a forensics team and I'll be there in 20 minutes. This is potential evidence in multiple felonies, including possible homicide if your brother's disappearance is connected to this Richard person's crimes. Christine, I need you to understand that your family is about to be at the center of a major criminal investigation. It's going to get ugly." I told her I understood. She said to keep everyone out of the bedroom until her team arrived and to document who'd already been in the room and what they'd touched. After I hung up, I looked at my parents. "Detective Kowalski is coming. This is going to become a full investigation into Richard and into Dylan's disappearance. It's going to be public. Everyone at church will know. Everyone we know will know. Are you prepared for that?" My father's face hardened. "That man hurt our son, hurt other people's children. I don't care what anyone thinks. We're doing this." My mother looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, but she nodded. "Dylan left this evidence for a reason. We have to honor that. We have to make sure Richard faces consequences even if Dylan never comes home." The thought that Dylan might never come home made my chest tighten, but I pushed the emotion down. There would be time for grief later. Right now, we needed to focus on justice. Detective Kowalski arrived in 18 minutes with 2 forensic technicians and another detective from Major Crimes named Raymond Torres. Raymond had been with Portland PD for 15 years and specialized in fraud and financial crimes. Lisa introduced him as the person who'd be handling the embezzlement angles while she focused on the exploitation and abuse evidence. They all wore gloves and booties as they entered the bedroom, treating it like the crime scene it potentially was. Lisa photographed everything systematically, while Raymond began documenting the financial records. One of the forensic techs, a woman named Alicia Brennan, who'd been doing this work for 12 years, carefully removed documents from the walls and placed them in evidence bags, labeling each one with location and description. Lisa pulled me aside into the living room while they worked. "Walk me through your brother's disappearance timeline, every detail you remember." I told her about October 8th, how Dylan had missed a family dinner, which was unusual because he never missed those, how his phone went straight to voicemail and his car was found in his apartment parking lot, how his last social media post had been 2 days before his disappearance, a photo of coffee with the caption, "Complicated Mornings," how none of his friends had heard from him and his employer said he hadn't shown up for work that Monday, how the initial police response had been minimal because adult men disappear voluntarily all the time and there was no evidence of foul play. Lisa made notes on everything. Then she asked about Richard Ashford, how long we'd known him, what his role in our family had been. I explained the 13-year relationship, how trusted Richard was, how integrated into our lives. Lisa's expression grew darker as I talked. Predators like this specifically cultivate trust with entire families. It gives them access and makes victims afraid to speak up because they know no one will believe them over the beloved pastor. Your brother was probably terrified of destroying your family's relationship with the church and with Richard. She paused. Christine, I need to ask this directly. Did you ever notice anything inappropriate between Richard and Dylan? Any boundary violations, unusual closeness, private meetings? I thought back through years of memories, searching for red flags I'd missed. There had been times when Richard and Dylan spent hours alone together, but that had seemed normal for a mentorship relationship. Richard had taken Dylan on trips, bought him gifts, given him money when he was struggling financially, but we'd interpreted all of that as generosity and care. Had there been moments that felt off? Maybe. Dylan had seemed anxious around Richard sometimes, eager to please him in ways that now felt desperate rather than respectful. But I'd attributed that to Dylan's general anxiety and insecurity, not to manipulation by a predator. I didn't see it, I admitted. Or I saw it and didn't recognize what it was. I failed him. Lisa touched my arm. Predators are skilled at hiding their behavior. That's why they're successful. Don't blame yourself. Focus on helping us build a case now. Raymond emerged from the bedroom with the laptop carefully sealed in an evidence bag. This is extensive documentation. Your brother was meticulous. He's got financial records going back 9 years, showing systematic theft from church accounts. He's got testimony from at least 11 different victims, some recorded, some written. He's got photos and communications that establish a clear pattern of grooming and manipulation. If even half of this is admissible, we can bury Richard Ashford under so many charges he'll die in prison. The satisfaction in Raymond's voice was clear. He'd seen too many financial predators escape consequences. This one wouldn't. Lisa asked if we knew where Richard Ashford was right now. I checked my phone and saw he'd texted me just that morning asking if there was any news about Dylan and offering to organize a prayer vigil at the church. The normalcy of that text felt obscene now that I knew what he'd done. I showed Lisa the message. She said they'd be bringing Richard in for questioning immediately, but wanted to coordinate with the FBI first since some of the crimes appeared to cross state lines. She made several phone calls speaking in quiet tones with people I couldn't hear. When she hung up, she said an FBI agent specializing in crimes against children would be joining the investigation, and that they'd be executing search warrants on Richard's home, office, and church files within the next 6 hours. My father asked what we should do about the church leadership. Should we warn them? Give them a heads up that their youth pastor was about to be arrested? Lisa was firm. No contact with anyone at the church until we've secured all evidence. Richard likely has allies there who'd help him destroy evidence if they knew we were coming. The senior pastor will be interviewed, but we can't risk tipping them off. That made sense legally, but emotionally it felt wrong to keep this from people who'd trusted Richard for years. How many other families had children who'd been victimized? How many parents had no idea their trust had been exploited? The forensic team worked for 3 hours, carefully documenting and removing every piece of evidence from Dylan's apartment. They took the laptop, external hard drives, file folders, photographs, and even the whiteboard with Dylan's warning message. Lisa said everything would be analyzed and cataloged, and that we'd receive copies of relevant materials once the investigation was underway. She asked us to compile a list of everyone we knew who'd had contact with Richard through the church youth program over the past 13 years. That list would be used to identify potential victims who might not have come forward yet. The thought of how many people Richard might have hurt made me feel sick. At 4:30 that afternoon, Lisa called to tell me they'd arrested Richard Ashford at the church. He'd been leading an evening youth group session when detectives arrived with a warrant. Lisa said he'd initially tried to act confused and cooperative, claiming there must be some misunderstanding, but when they'd mentioned Dylan's evidence room, his demeanor had changed. He'd refused to answer questions without a lawyer and had been transported to county jail where he was being held on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and multiple counts related to exploitation of minors. Bail had been set at $2 million. Lisa said the FBI was now officially involved and that additional charges would likely be filed as they processed all the evidence Dylan had compiled. The news hit the media by 6 o'clock that evening. Youth pastor arrested on multiple charges, including embezzlement and abuse. My phone exploded with calls and texts from people we knew, church members, family friends, all of them shocked and asking if it was true. Some messages were supportive, expressing disbelief that Richard could do such things and suggesting there must be a mistake. Those messages made my blood boil. Dylan had spent years compiling evidence precisely because he knew people wouldn't believe the truth. The fact that some people still defended Richard even after his arrest proved how right Dylan had been to be afraid. My mother called the senior pastor, Reverend Donald Chambers, who'd been at Cornerstone for 28 years and had hired Richard 13 years ago. Donald sounded devastated when she told him about Dylan's evidence. He said he'd had no idea, that Richard had seemed exemplary, that the church would be cooperating fully with investigators. He asked if he could visit us to offer support. My mother said no, not yet. We needed space to process everything. After she hung up, she sat at our kitchen table and cried for an hour. My father held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make this better. The FBI agent assigned to the case called me the next morning. Her name was Special Agent Rebecca Flynn, and she'd been with the Bureau's Crimes Against Children unit for 9 years. She wanted to meet with our family to discuss Dylan's disappearance and its potential connection to the evidence he'd compiled. We met at the FBI field office downtown, in a conference room that felt too cold and too bright. Agent Flynn was in her late 30s with sharp eyes and the kind of controlled intensity that suggested she'd seen terrible things and refused to become numb to them. She had files spread across the table, printouts of documents from Dylan's apartment. Agent Flynn explained that they'd recovered extensive communications between Dylan and Richard spanning 6 years. The messages showed a clear pattern of grooming that began when Dylan was 16, escalating to financial control and emotional manipulation, and eventually to explicit blackmail. Richard had convinced Dylan that he was complicit in Richard's crimes because he'd helped manage some of the financial transfers in the early years before he understood what was happening. Richard had used that supposed complicity as leverage, threatening to expose Dylan as an accomplice if he went to the police. The manipulation was textbook predator behavior, targeting a vulnerable teenager and gradually trapping him in a web of fear and obligation. Agent Flynn said they'd also identified 12 other victims from Dylan's evidence, ranging in age from 14 to 19 at the time of their victimization. Each one followed a similar pattern. Richard would identify a troubled or vulnerable teenage boy in the youth program, offer special attention and mentorship, create emotional dependence, and then exploit that dependence for his own gratification. Some victims experienced financial abuse, others emotional and psychological manipulation, and several reported inappropriate physical contact that met legal definitions of assault. Dylan's documentation included recorded interviews with 8 of these victims, all of whom had been too afraid to come forward before because Richard had convinced them they'd be blamed or not believed. I asked Agent Flynn what she thought had happened to Dylan. Why did he disappear instead of just releasing this evidence? She said they were working on several theories. One was that Richard had discovered Dylan was building a case against him and had threatened him more seriously, possibly with violence, causing Dylan to flee for his safety. Another was that Dylan had planned his disappearance strategically, knowing the evidence would be found and wanting to protect himself from Richard's retaliation, while giving investigators time to build a case. A third possibility, which Agent Flynn said quietly, was that Richard had done something to Dylan to prevent the evidence from being released. They were treating Dylan's disappearance as a potential homicide, even though there was no body and no direct evidence of violence. My mother made a sound like she'd been punched. The idea that Richard might have killed Dylan was something we'd all been avoiding thinking about too directly. Agent Flynn apologized for being blunt, but said we needed to understand the full scope of possibilities. They were searching Richard's property, his vehicles, and any location he had access to, looking for evidence of Dylan's whereabouts. They'd seized Richard's phone and computer and were analyzing his movements around the time of Dylan's disappearance. If there was any evidence that Richard had harmed Dylan, they'd find it. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded in ways that made national news. The FBI discovered that Richard had been running similar schemes at 2 previous churches before Cornerstone, victimizing at least 9 additional minors and embezzling roughly $560,000 in total across all 3 institutions. He'd moved locations when victims started asking questions or when financial discrepancies were noticed, but he'd never faced consequences because church leadership had handled issues internally, rather than involving police. The pattern of institutional protection had allowed Richard to continue victimizing people for over 15 years. Media coverage was intense and brutal, exposing Richard's methodology and the church's failures to protect children. Cornerstone Community Church released a statement apologizing to victims and pledging full cooperation with investigators. Reverend Chambers announced his resignation, saying he'd failed in his duty to protect the congregation. The church board hired an independent firm to audit all financial records and offered to pay for counseling services for anyone who'd been victimized. Several families came forward with stories about their children's experiences with Richard, each one adding to the mountain of evidence against him. The community response was divided, with some people expressing outrage at Richard's betrayal, and others questioning whether the accusations were exaggerated or coordinated attacks on a good man. Those defenders grew quieter as more evidence emerged. I spent those 2 weeks in a strange limbo between grief and rage and administrative necessity. There were victim advocates to coordinate with, legal proceedings to track, media requests to decline. My law firm gave me indefinite leave to focus on family matters. My ex-husband, who'd remained friendly despite our divorce, called to offer support and to say he'd always thought Richard seemed too perfect to be trustworthy. I appreciated the thought but wished he'd mentioned that suspicion years ago when it might have mattered. Friends from church reached out with awkward messages trying to be supportive while processing their own betrayal at having trusted Richard. I responded to most of them with brief thanks and ignored the ones that felt performative. On November 15th, exactly 38 days after Dylan's disappearance, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was familiar and strange at the same time, rougher and more tired than I remembered. "Christine, it's me. It's Dylan." My knees went weak and I sat down hard on the floor. "Dylan? Oh my God, where are you? Are you okay?" He said he was safe, that he'd been hiding in Montana at a cabin owned by a friend who didn't ask questions. He'd seen the news about Richard's arrest and the investigation and had decided it was finally safe to make contact. He said he'd disappeared because Richard had discovered he was building the evidence file and had threatened to kill our parents if Dylan didn't destroy everything and disappear permanently. Dylan had believed the threat was credible and had chosen to vanish rather than risk our family's safety. I was crying and laughing at the same time, relief flooding through me. "We found your apartment, the evidence room. Dylan, you did it. You documented everything perfectly, and now Richard is going to prison. The FBI is involved. There are 12 other victims who've come forward. You saved them." Dylan's voice broke. "I didn't save anyone. I let him hurt people for years because I was too scared to do anything. I should have gone to the police when I was 16. I should have been braver." I told him what Agent Flynn had explained, that he'd been a victim himself, groomed and manipulated by an expert predator. That the blame belonged entirely to Richard, not to a scared teenager who'd been systematically abused and controlled. Dylan said he wanted to come home but was afraid Richard might have connections who'd retaliate on his behalf. I told him about the investigation scope, the FBI involvement, the evidence being so overwhelming that Richard's attorneys were already discussing plea deals. Richard was facing the rest of his life in prison, and would never be in a position to threaten anyone again. Dylan was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd be home in 2 days and asked if I'd pick him up from the bus station. Of course I would. I'd have flown to Montana to get him if he'd asked. I called Agent Flynn immediately after hanging up with Dylan and told her he'd made contact. She said she'd need to interview him extensively, but was relieved he was alive and safe. She'd been preparing our family for the worst. Dylan arrived at the Portland bus station on November 17th at 6:30 in the evening. I was waiting with our parents, all of us anxious and eager and terrified about what state he'd be in. When he walked off the bus carrying a single backpack, looking thinner and older than he had 5 weeks ago, my mother sobbed and ran to him. He let her hold him, his face pressed against her shoulder, and I saw his whole body shaking. Our father joined the embrace and I hung back for a moment, giving them space. Then Dylan looked at me over their shoulders and I saw his eyes were red and exhausted and full of something like hope. I joined the group hug and we stood there in the bus station while other passengers moved around us, just holding on to each other. We took Dylan home and he showered for nearly an hour, like he was trying to wash away the past month. When he came out, wearing clean clothes and looking slightly more like himself, he sat at the kitchen table and told us everything. How Richard had started grooming him at 16 with special attention and private meetings that felt inappropriate, but that Dylan hadn't known how to refuse. How it had escalated to financial entanglement with Richard giving Dylan money and then claiming Dylan owed him. How Richard had shown Dylan the embezzlement schemes and manipulated him into helping with minor administrative tasks before Dylan understood what he was really doing. How by the time Dylan realized the scope of Richard's crimes, he was terrified that he'd be seen as complicit if he reported it. Dylan explained that he'd started documenting everything 3 years ago after Richard targeted another teenager Dylan knew and cared about. Watching Richard use the same manipulation tactics on someone else had broken through Dylan's paralysis and made him determined to stop it. He'd spent 3 years gathering evidence, tracking down previous victims, building airtight cases. He'd planned to release everything to the FBI on October 15th, but Richard had discovered what he was doing and had shown up at Dylan's apartment on October 7th with explicit threats against our parents. Richard had said he knew where they lived, knew their routines, and that if Dylan didn't destroy the evidence and disappear, there would be consequences. Dylan had believed him and had run. Agent Flynn interviewed Dylan for 6 hours the next day, recording every detail of his testimony. She said his evidence and first-hand account would be crucial for prosecution. Richard's attorneys had been trying to claim the financial crimes were accounting errors and that the allegations of abuse were fabricated by disgruntled former church members. Dylan's testimony, combined with the evidence he'd compiled from other victims, made those defenses impossible. The U.S. Attorney's Office was preparing a comprehensive indictment that would include over 30 separate charges spanning 15 years of criminal activity. Richard Ashford was going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The trial began in March, 4 months after Dylan's return. Richard had rejected plea deals, apparently convinced he could convince a jury of his innocence through charisma and manipulation. That arrogance proved to be his final mistake. The prosecution presented Dylan's evidence methodically, piece by piece, showing the jury exactly how Richard had operated. They called 11 victims to testify, including Dylan, and each one described the same pattern of grooming, manipulation, exploitation, and threats. The defense tried to attack their credibility, suggesting they were coordinating false stories or misremembering innocent interactions. But the documented evidence, the financial records, the recorded conversations, all of it corroborated every accusation. Dylan testified on the 4th day of trial. I sat in the gallery with our parents and watched him walk through years of abuse with devastating calm. He explained how Richard had targeted him specifically because he was struggling with identity issues and family pressure, how Richard had positioned himself as the only person who truly understood Dylan, how that emotional manipulation had progressed to financial control and eventually to explicit blackmail. He read aloud from Richard's text messages, including ones where Richard threatened to destroy our family's reputation if Dylan spoke out. The jury looked horrified. Several people in the gallery were crying. Richard sat at the defense table with his expression carefully neutral, but I saw his jaw tighten when Dylan described the threats against our parents. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 9 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 32 counts. Richard showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, but I saw color drain from his face. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. In the interim, additional victims came forward, emboldened by the guilty verdicts. The final count of people Richard had victimized reached 23, spanning over 15 years. Each story was variations on the same theme: a vulnerable teenager targeted by a charismatic predator who'd hidden behind religious authority and community trust. At sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. 11 people stood up and described how Richard's abuse had affected their lives, their relationships, their ability to trust. Some had struggled with addiction and mental health issues directly tied to the trauma Richard inflicted. Others had left religion entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with what had been done to them in its name. Dylan spoke last, reading from prepared remarks about the years he'd spent afraid and silenced, about the courage it had taken to compile evidence while knowing he might not survive to see it used, about the other victims who deserved justice even if they were too afraid to seek it themselves. The judge sentenced Richard Ashford to 45 years in federal prison for the financial crimes, and an additional 30 years for crimes against children, sentences to run consecutively. 75 years total. Richard was 51 years old, which meant he'd die in prison. The judge said Richard's position of trust and authority made his crimes particularly egregious, that he'd exploited faith and vulnerability for personal gratification, and that the sentence reflected society's absolute rejection of such predatory behavior. Richard was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt something loosen in my chest. It was over. He'd never hurt anyone again. In the months after sentencing, our family began the slow work of healing. Dylan started therapy with a counselor who specialized in religious trauma and complex PTSD. Our parents worked through their guilt about not seeing what was happening, about trusting Richard so completely. I processed my own failure to protect my younger brother, the signs I'd missed or misinterpreted. We had family therapy sessions where we learned to communicate about the trauma without letting it consume us. It was hard work, painful and exhausting, but necessary. Cornerstone Community Church eventually closed, unable to recover from the scandal and the mass exodus of members who couldn't reconcile staying in a place so thoroughly associated with betrayal. The building was sold and became a community center. Several other churches that had employed Richard also faced investigations and lawsuits from victims, leading to policy changes across denominational lines about background checks, supervision requirements, and mandatory reporting. Dylan's evidence had exposed not just one predator, but systemic failures that had enabled him, and those systems were finally being dismantled. A year after the trial, Dylan and I drove to the storage unit where his apartment contents had been placed after the investigation concluded. We needed to sort through his things and decide what to keep. Among the boxes, we found the notebooks where he'd first started documenting Richard's crimes, early entries showing Dylan's confusion and fear evolving into determined purpose. We found photos from church events that now felt poisonous, images of Richard surrounded by smiling teenagers who had no idea what he was. And we found a letter Dylan had written to himself on the day he'd decided to start gathering evidence, a letter that said simply, "If I don't do this, who will? If I don't protect the next victim, who does he hurt because I was too afraid? This ends with me." I showed Dylan the letter and he read it with tears streaming down his face. "I was so scared," he said. "Every day for 3 years I was terrified he'd find out what I was doing. And then when he did, when he threatened you and Mom and Dad, I thought I'd failed completely, that all that work was for nothing." I put my arm around his shoulders. "You didn't fail. You saved 23 people from believing they were alone and worthless and complicit in their own abuse. You gave them permission to come forward by showing them someone believed them enough to fight. That's not failure. That's heroism." Dylan works now as an advocate for abuse survivors, using his experience to help others navigate reporting, investigation, and recovery processes. He speaks at conferences about grooming tactics and institutional failures. He's published articles about the importance of believing victims and creating safe reporting channels. He's turned his trauma into purpose, and while I know the scars will never fully heal, I also see strength in him that wasn't there before. The kind of strength that comes from surviving something meant to destroy you, and choosing to use that survival to protect others. Our family still gathers for dinners every Sunday, reclaiming that tradition Richard had corrupted with his presence. We don't talk about him anymore unless something related to the case comes up. We've learned to exist in the space after crisis, where life continues and healing happens in increments too small to notice day to day, but profound over time. We've learned that trust, once broken so catastrophically, rebuilds slowly and requires constant maintenance. We've learned that the people who seem most trustworthy sometimes hide the darkest secrets, and that protecting yourself and others requires vigilance without paranoia. Sometimes I think about the alternate universe where Dylan never compiled that evidence, where he'd stayed silent out of fear, and Richard had continued operating for another decade. How many more victims there would have been? How many lives destroyed? The fact that Dylan found the courage to document everything despite being terrified for his own safety and his family's well-being still amazes me. He was 23 years old when he started that project, barely more than a kid himself, taking on a predator who'd had 15 years of practice manipulating systems and people. And he won. Not perfectly, not without cost, but definitively. The bedroom in Dylan's apartment, the one with walls covered in evidence, was photographed and cataloged so thoroughly that those images are now used in FBI training programs about victim advocacy and evidence collection. Dylan's methodology, his attention to detail, his understanding of what would be needed to build prosecutable cases, all of it exceeded what trained investigators typically see from civilian sources. Agent Flynn told us that Dylan's work had likely prevented several other predators from escaping accountability because it established such clear patterns of institutional failure that other organizations took notice and implemented reforms. Richard Ashford is currently serving his sentence at a federal facility in California. He'll be eligible for parole in 35 years when he's 86 years old. Dylan has said he'll attend every parole hearing to ensure Richard stays imprisoned, though statistically Richard will likely die before eligibility. Some of the other victims have said they'll attend too, a united front ensuring that Richard's crimes are never forgotten or minimized. I plan to be there as well, sitting in the gallery as visible reminder that families of victims don't forget and don't forgive predators who exploit trust so thoroughly. I think about that phone call from Frank Castellano often, how he'd insisted I bring family members before showing us what he'd found. How different everything might have been if he'd called police first, if the evidence had been processed without family context. We might never have understood the full scope of what Dylan had endured and accomplished. We might have been kept at arm's length from the investigation, treated as peripheral rather than central. Frank's instinct to let us see Dylan's work first, to let us understand what our brother and son had been fighting against, gave us agency in the justice process. We weren't just victims' family members. We were witnesses to Dylan's courage and partners in ensuring his evidence achieved its purpose. The landlord's words echo sometimes. Get your family here first. All of them. As if he'd known we'd need each other to process what we were about to see. As if he'd understood that some discoveries are too heavy to bear alone. He was right. Standing in that bedroom surrounded by evidence of my brother's quiet war against a predator, I'd needed my parents there. We'd needed to see it together, to share the shock and horror and eventual determination to see justice done. Family isn't just about shared DNA or history, it's about standing together when the foundation cracks and insisting that truth matters more than comfort. Dylan says sometimes that the hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence or even disappearing when Richard threatened him. The hardest part was living for years knowing Richard was hurting people and feeling powerless to stop it immediately. Every day he spent building his case was a day Richard remained free, potentially victimizing someone new. That weight, that moral burden of strategic patience versus immediate action, nearly destroyed Dylan. He tells other survivors now that justice takes time, that building unassailable cases requires documentation and corroboration, and that the weight doesn't mean you're complicit in ongoing harm. It means you're ensuring the predator faces consequences that stick. I'm proud of my brother in ways I can barely articulate, not just for his courage or his meticulous evidence gathering, but for his refusal to let Richard's manipulation define his worth. For coming home after disappearing, for testifying despite knowing it would make him relive trauma publicly, for choosing to use his experience to help others rather than retreating into protective isolation. He's stronger than I ever gave him credit for, and the fact that I didn't see that strength earlier is one of my deepest regrets. But we can't undo the past. We can only honor it by ensuring the future looks different. The bedroom is empty now, the walls bare again after forensic teams removed every piece of evidence. But I can still see it in my mind exactly as it was that day. Photographs and documents and red string connecting a web of abuse that spanned over a decade. I can still see Dylan's handwriting on the whiteboard, that desperate warning meant for whoever found his work after he was gone. Do not let him destroy this evidence. We didn't. We honored Dylan's fight by seeing it through to its conclusion. Richard Ashford will die in prison. His victims have begun healing. And Dylan is alive, safe, and using his voice to protect others from predators who hide behind trust and authority. That's not just justice, that's vindication. And it's everything Dylan deserved after years of being told he was complicit, that he'd be blamed, that no one would believe him. Everyone believes him now. Everyone sees Richard for exactly what he was. And Dylan gets to live with that knowledge, that his courage mattered, that his evidence changed lives, that he was right to fight even when fighting felt impossible. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.